Insular India. Archaeological Legacies of the Indian Subcontinent by D.W. Draffin. Gondwana. Let's start at the very beginning. This Pangaea-era supercontinent of 100 million square kilometers once contained nearly two-thirds of Earth's surface area, including the masses that would eventually break apart into Africa, Antarctica, Australia, and many others. Around 120 million years ago, the shifting plates and mountain-building orogenies of Earth's mobile crust pulled Gondwana apart, forming smaller continents that only begin to look familiar tens of millions of years later. Also, Gondwana. In Sanskrit, the forest of the Gondi people. The Gondwana region in eastern India on the northern end of the Deccan steppe is drier than the coast, with monsoon forests and rugged hills. Basalt remains of the Deccan traps, an ancient volcano, fill the landscape in the west. And further east, the geology is even older, featuring Precambrian deposits that preserve geological evidence for the breaking up of the supercontinent all those millennia ago. These were some of the initial mineralogical and geomagnetic discoveries of the 19th century that led the Austrian geologist Eduard Suess to name the entire supercontinent from which India separated Gondwana, or Gondwana land. After India separated from Madagascar 88 million years ago, the subterranean plates expanded and contracted in turn, pushing the isolated landmass across the open ocean, where it eventually made contact with the south of Asia. But before we move ahead, let's focus on that 11 million year period when the Indian subcontinent was its own major island, adrift in the sea. Evidence of unique biological lineages exist from this time, when what is technically known to geologists as Insular India evolved many of its own terrestrial species. 11 million years is a long time to be alone. Fossils exist of vertebrates from this lost period, which show influences from the African continent they left and the Asian continent they approached. But then, apocalypse. Nearly every vertebrate from that period was wiped out in what is known as the Cretaceous-Paleogene extinction event, which has popularly become known as the Chicxulub asteroid strike that exterminated all non-avian dinosaur species worldwide. But a supporting explanation for the extinction of so much life on Earth at this time can be found here on the Indian subcontinent. The Deccan Traps were one of the largest shield volcanoes in the world, erupting continuously for 700,000 years and cooling the planet. Between their poisonous sun-blocking gases, the catastrophic endless winter of the asteroid strike, and a general drop in sea level, the world of 66 million years ago was not a hospitable place to be for any tetrapod larger than a goat. The Indian tectonic plate merged with the Eurasian plate at this time. Among such apocalyptic imagery of early Earth, it's tempting to think of India as crashing instantaneously against the south of the Eurasian plate and driving the Himalayas and the Tibetan Plateau straight up into the sky. But it was a long process, the combined Indo-Australian plate moving steadily north to this day, pushing the rumpled landmass of the Eurasian plate upward like a bunched rug. It is in this context that the land of India was formed, filled with many unique species and shielded almost entirely from the rest of the Asian continent by the impassable Himalayas. India has developed its own history, somewhat isolated from the wider Eurasian world. How isolated is a matter of fierce academic as well as cultural, political, linguistic, and religious debate. Yet from this unique geological position, Insular India's genetics, language, and culture formed some of the foundational pillars of modern humanity. Evidence of early hominids exists in many places on the Indian subcontinent. In Rajasthan, in the Didwana region, a handful of pre-hominid fossils have been identified that may be 7 million years old, placing them more in the realm of great apes, such as Organopithecus, than true hominids. Hundreds of stone tools have been discovered here over a period beginning 400,000 years ago. In the Pune district of Maharashtra, evidence of hominid activity has been dated to 1.4 million years ago. On the southeastern coast, in ancient Atirampakam, Tamil Nadu, beneath some of the earliest human settlements in India, stone tools have been found from approximately 385,000 years ago. Known as the Madrasian culture, its earliest artifacts may be 1.5 million years old. But these are not the only findings. Nearly every region in India boasts archaeological sites that stretch back to the dawn of time. The state of Karnataka is currently best known for the high-tech city of Bengaluru, but it also hosts some of the earliest records of hominids in India. In its Hongsi and Baichbal valleys, hundreds of sites contain over 15,000 artifacts, such as hand axes, cleavers, polyhedrons, scrapers, and knives of the Acheulean industrial complex. This is a tradition most closely identified with Homo erectus that began across Eurasia over 2 million years ago. Certain sites have been characterized as ancient factories of such tools, reaching back over 700,000 years. 2 fossilized herbivore teeth associated with these sites have been identified as being over 1.2 million years old, indicating that hominids have been active here since the lower Paleolithic. These are also likely the work of Homo erectus, but we can't say so for certain, because almost no hominid remains have been found with these tools. The earliest physical evidence of hominins on the Indian subcontinent is still in dispute. Remains have been found, such as the skull cup of the Narmada human. Found on the banks of the Narmada River in 1982, it shows signs of being used as a skull cup, the top portion of a human skull that had been used in rituals for drinking or as a trophy. This skull cup was originally identified when it was discovered as 700,000 years old and the only physical example of Homo erectus in India. But they were also originally identified as male. Now they are more widely accepted as a female in her 30s and from a later period, most likely between 50 to 160,000 years ago, and more likely an archaic Homo sapiens or from an otherwise unknown lineage of Homo heidelbergensis, a finding that generates as many questions as it answers. In much of South Asia, the high humidity and wet soils break down buried skeletons and organic matter such as wooden funerary structures faster than in more temperate parts of the world. So the coastal and interior lowlands of India may owe their lack of prehistoric ruins and remains to the dissolutions of time. What may have come before is either drowned under a sea that has risen dozens of meters over the last 100,000 years, or digested by the forests, bogs, and jungles of this verdant land. Yet paleogenetics has revealed what physical archaeology could not: that coastal India was the home of an ancestral population of modern humans known as the AASI, or Ancient Ancestral South Indians. These were the first people to be one step removed from those who had crossed the Red Sea out of Africa. Following the coast from East Africa along a southern Asian route, we have evidence of small groups taking both coastal and interior routes into Asia. But as we speak, the accepted interpretation of a single out-of-Africa event for modern humans over 60,000 years ago has been disputed in the prehistoric archaeological community by converging lines of evidence from across Eurasia. One of these lines of evidence is another volcanic eruption in the region. The Toba supervolcano event from 74,000 years ago on the Indonesian island of Sumatra marks an indelible line of gray ash in the stratigraphy of the late Pleistocene. One of the most dramatic and violent eruptions in the historical record. Volcanologists estimate that over 2,800 cubic kilometers of pumice and volcanic ash was ejected over a period of only 9 to 14 days, affecting the climate, the atmosphere, and all living things for perhaps 1,000 years. Some researchers point to mitochondrial genetic studies which indicate that this climatic collapse caused a near extinction that reduced the global human population to just 1,000 breeding pairs in Africa. Others dispute this interpretation, however, and point to the Jwalapuram site in southern India, where the quality of tools, and therefore the quality of life, were similar both above and below the 15-centimeter layer of Toba ash that covered the Indian subcontinent. Although other sites show dramatic losses and abrupt termination of activity, at least some of the ancient ancestral South Indians seem to have survived the eruption without losing their technologies. But that would mean these Homo sapiens were already out of Africa 74,000 years ago. And if that's true, who were they, and how did they get there? In the Toba catastrophe theory, its supporters argue that the eruption accounts for the prehistoric bottleneck that geneticists find, as ancient DNA studies have indicated that somewhere between 50 to 100,000 years ago, the human population constricted to no more than 10,000 individuals. Yet what hasn't been proven conclusively here is whether the Jwalapuram site was indeed inhabited by modern humans. Some researchers favor models of 2 or more major waves of emigration from Africa, as well as the possible existence of previously unknown hominid lineages that emerged from Africa over a much wider time frame, including possible mosaics and hybrid humans, whose remains have been found in caves from Spain to Crimea to China. In 2017, researchers at the Indian National Institute of Biomedical Genomics made a surprising discovery while trying to trace backward the lineage of 100 genomic samples of modern Indian subjects. They discovered genetic evidence for the first time of a mysterious population that disappeared over 50,000 years ago. Joining the distinct genetic and linguistic populations of ancestral North Indian, ancestral South Indian, ancestral Tibeto-Burmese, and ancestral Austroasiatics are an as yet unnamed fifth people that may hold a clue to the emergence of humans from Africa. This lost genetic signal is highest among the Andaman and Nicobar Islanders of the Indian Ocean and is closely associated with the archaic population long called Negritos, who are now, for obvious reasons, being renamed and identified in more local terms across the entirety of their epic ancient migratory route along the shores of the Indian Ocean into South Asia and eventually Oceania as far as Taiwan and the Philippines. These emigrants may have left the coast of Africa as long as 80,000 years ago, putting them in South India in time for the Toba eruption. Or they may have been the hybrid progeny of these coastal emigrants and the Neanderthals and other related hominids they found along the way. More and more, the archaeological community is beginning to characterize the expansion of humanity out of Africa as an intermittent stream of false starts, dead ends, and modest transfers of small populations from 80,000 to around 60,000 years ago. In the northwest of the Indian subcontinent, the Shivalik Hills stretch across modern Nepal, North India, and Pakistan. A lower rank of the Himalayas, these are one of the only passable regions from the larger Eurasian continent. Homo erectus fossils have been found here, as well as Acheulean microlithic technologies associated with them, such as heavy stone axes. These are known as the Soanian culture, and seem to provide a direct link from hominids to archaic humans to the earliest known Neolithic settlements of South Asia. In Yedur Wadi, stone tools date back over 350,000 years. How the Soan peoples first developed and eventually dispersed has been a matter of debate among anthropologists and archaeologists for generations. Some favor a model that indicates these hominids began manufacturing tools and hunting the region as long as 700,000 years ago as a single, continuous tradition until 120,000 years ago, while others favor a model of 3 broad developmental phases. It is reasonable to assume that none of the early Soanian culture featured Homo sapiens, yet nothing points to a specific hominin because no remains have yet been found. The earliest, unambiguous Homo sapiens remains we possess from the Indian subcontinent come from the island nation of Sri Lanka. A skeleton named Balangoda Man was found in the caves of central Sri Lanka in a region of montane forest and ecologically diverse river headwaters known as the Horton Plains. Dated to 30,000 years old, Balangoda Man appears to be a direct ancestor of the Veda people of Sri Lanka, who have lived in its jungles stretching back into prehistory. The district in which they reside is called the Sabaragamua province, which is locally believed to translate to the village of the forest barbarians. Genetic studies have lent support to the belief that current Veda people are directly related to the earliest modern humans in South India, while also closely related to the Sinhalese, who came to Sri Lanka perhaps 2,500 years ago, and the Tamil, who arrived about 1,000 years before. The Veda possess ancient haplogroups R and U in much greater proportion, pointing at a likely local origin in ancestral India. Across the north of the Indian subcontinent, archaeological remains provide evidence for the peopling of the region. In Uttar Pradesh, the first signs of Homo sapiens have been dated over 70,000 years old. For millennia, these nomadic hunter-gatherers survived and even thrived in a landscape filled with Pleistocene megafauna such as elephants and hippos and giant canines. The Baghor stone is a relic that comes from an Upper Paleolithic site in Madhya Pradesh from nearly 12,000 years ago. Painted with yellow pigments, it is a triangular sandstone that represents the efforts of the ancient culture, which are further evidenced by an entire small blade industry that existed here for millennia. Back to Gondwana, the Indian one. On its western edge, the Bhimbetka rock shelters of Madhya Pradesh in central India are a UNESCO World Heritage Site. containing over 750 shelters. These caves and depressions cover an area of 10 square kilometers and possess innumerable paintings stretching back 10,000 years or more. These include some of the earliest known representations of the human form, with figures dancing, and some of the earliest evidence of prehistoric spirituality. Perhaps the oldest known stone floors and walls have been discovered here, with new additions contributed until medieval times. To the north, the sites of Lahura Dewa and Jhusi sit near the confluence of the Yamuna and Ganges rivers. Pottery found in Lahura Dewa and evidence of perhaps the earliest rice farming in the world date both sites to over 7,000 BCE. Even further north, in Haryana, along the banks of the Ghaggar River, evidence of an ancient civilization in the small village of Birana may indicate the origins of pre-Harappan civilization from as long ago as 8,000 BCE. Before the discoveries of Birana, Mehrgarh in Balochistan, at the western edge of the Indian subcontinent, had long been identified as the oldest origin of the Indus Valley civilization. Beginning circa 6500 BCE, it contains evidence of farming and cattle herding and organized structures. The hunter-gatherer nomads of the Indus Valley downriver began to gain agriculture at this time, developing into a widespread Neolithic civilization that has been much studied and still little understood. The Harappan, or Indus Valley Civilization, which at its zenith in the Chalcolithic period around 2200 BCE, covered an area that included the countries of Pakistan, northwestern India, and eastern Afghanistan. Its major cities of Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro held more than 50,000 inhabitants each. Their list of unique accomplishments and original developments is seemingly endless, from indoor plumbing with flushing toilets, to air conditioning, wind catchers, to the standardization of measurements, including the width of roads and walkways, the size of bricks throughout the region, and uniform weights and measures. Yet even though we possess thousands of examples of their written script, none have been able to identify what the spoken Harappan language was. Nearly all the inscriptions that have survived are quite short, no more than 4 or 5 symbols of the over 400 major characters that have been identified. So it has been nearly impossible to gain insight into the culture and traditions of these societies. Attempts to ascribe the Indus Valley script to the Sanskrit or Dravidian traditions have so far been unsuccessful. Theories abound, but none have gained any real traction because they have not been able to provide meaningful results. The Indus Valley civilization looms large in the cultural narrative of India. In a popular sense, many Indians believe it is the proto-civilization from which all else has sprung, and this status has led its supporters to conceive of it as purely Indian, the divine origin of their ancient culture. But this characterization of isolated purity is not supported by the archaeological record. What little we do know of the Indus Valley people is that above all they appear to have been traders, and that generally means caravans, shipping, international travel, and the intermixing of bloodlines, legacies, and languages. Artifacts from the Indus Valley civilization have been found among the treasures of its contemporaries, the early empires of Mesopotamia, and even further afield in ancient Egypt. Manufacturing and trading artisanal goods seems to have been a cornerstone of their economy, That means that when trade and ideas and developments came back to them from the wider world, indigenous culture mixed with the contribution of outsiders to create a host of technologies that were uniquely Indian. Yet what they did not have is as noteworthy as what they did. Despite their thousands of years of existence, there is no sign of a standing army, although it may have been the massive walls of their cities that successfully served to dissuade attacks. There are no palaces for an exalted upper class, no temples to their gods. And yet, some remarkable organizing force made of each of the cities and settlements of the Indus Valley a virtual copy of each other. They all shared the same pre-planned grid of wide streets, running north-south and east-west, with the same irrigation technologies, and artisanal and agricultural developments, such as the wheel and the sail. They manufactured and exported endless tools of bronze and copper, produced pottery and figurines, and most importantly, they preserved political and economic stability over thousands of years in a region that hasn't seen that level of rigid stability ever since. The Indian subcontinent entered the Chalcolithic period perhaps 7,000 years ago, when the proto-Harappan civilization was still in its early phases. The Neolithic package of agriculture, herding, and settlement spread generally across the Indian subcontinent from a west to east and north to south direction. Over the next several thousand years, these traditions matured, and the entire region featured a wide variety of proto-civilizations which, near the beginning of the Iron Age, nearly 4,000 years ago, began to develop into traditions which start to become familiar to modern researchers and historians. One of the fiercest disputes in India's early history is the subject of Aryan influence on the end of the Indus Valley civilization. A popular but incorrect image of raving barbarian horsemen from the northern steppe bearing down on the peaceful cities of the Indus Valley has taken decades to refute. Instead of an Aryan invasion that brought down the civilization in fire and blood, recent findings have recast it as a slow, piecemeal migration of small groups from the north, who, over the course of hundreds of years and many generations, began to preferentially influence the culture around them. Their language appears to have become dominant, with Proto-Sanskrit words appearing in more contexts at this time. Around 1900 BCE, the cities of the Indus Valley are slowly losing populations as people disperse for unknown reasons to the countryside. Could these two factors be related? They undoubtedly are to some degree, but no one can say with any degree of certainty if the arrival of the Aryans spelled doom for the Harappans. Some will even claim, to retain a sense of indigenous purity, that the Aryans never arrived from anywhere but were instead a local product of their great cities. Called the out-of-India theory, this is primarily a religious viewpoint, however, and convincing evidence for it has not been found. The Indus Valley civilization has very much become the centerpiece ancient civilization of the Indian subcontinent. So much so that other cultures and ethnicities of the Upper Paleolithic and Neolithic periods have been sidelined. Yet in the interior and the south and east of the subcontinent, other traditions arose at the same time, 7,000 or 8,000 years ago, such as those who created rock art in Andhra Pradesh at the sites of Akkampalli, Katavaram, and Chintakunta. Figures of elephants, birds, bulls, and reptiles join human figures and geometric shapes on these rock faces, in shelters and caves in the interior of the region. or the Ahar Banas culture of Rajasthan and Madhya Pradesh. Named after the river valleys of the Ahar and Banas rivers, their pottery is mainly a black and red ware style that borrows from the neighboring Indus Valley traditions, but also seems to be influenced by the Bactria-Margiana cultural complex of Afghanistan, far to the north. Over 90 of their settlements have been found in the Banas River Valley alone, such as Balatal, which features remains of herded animals, agricultural products such as lentils and millet, and fortifications that indicate the settlement may not have enjoyed the peace their Indus Valley neighbors to the west did. In Kerala, in the southwest, much of its current coast was believed to be underwater until somewhat recently. The evidence that remains of human development is in the eastern highlands, among the mountains of the western Ghats. Rock etchings, cave inscriptions, and menhirs from around 6,000 years ago document the emergence from ancient Dravidian roots of Proto-Tamil language and cultural traditions of the succeeding Tamil empires. In neighboring Tamil Nadu, a Neolithic stone axe head has been found that is 7,000 years old, which supports the depiction of this region as lightly settled and still the province of nomadic hunter-gatherers for longer than many neighboring regions. The Hargaris of Jharkhand are megalithic structures whose existence stretches back thousands of years. The nearby Punkri Burwadi monumental structures are some of the earliest examples of burial tombs aligned to horizon astronomy and the transits of the sun. But what's extraordinary is that these are not abandoned sites. These are living history, or even prehistory. Many of them are still in use by the villages of the region for funerary traditions and even the construction of new menhirs. This is the challenge of studying the origins of India. For many of its 1.4 billion inhabitants, they still live in the same villages and towns that their ancestors did, with unbroken traditions stretching back millennia. They have their oral and written histories that do not always align with the archaeological record, and the certainty that outsiders can never understand India is widespread. But us outsiders do what we can. In Bihar, prehistoric rock paintings have been excavated from the alluvium on the banks of the Ganges at the Neolithic settlement of Chirand, depicting forest scenes with activities like dancing and hunting. These are some of the oldest paintings on the Indian subcontinent. Found in the Kaimur Hills, as well as the southern districts of Jamui and Nawada, these sites are also associated with Neolithic and later development, and connect the inhabitants of the region to those who lived there thousands of years ago. In the interests of clarity, this episode will end at the dawn of the Vedic Civilization. Once India enters the Iron Age and begins recording its own history, it becomes a land of attested kingdoms and empires, so well documented that each of the thousands would deserve their own episode. The Vedic literature, or the four Vedas, which many Indians consider historical documents that were received by ancient sages in moments of spiritual enlightenment, document the origins of the Hindu religion in Sanskrit as a complex oral tradition that has survived unbroken since the second millennium BCE. But recently, some linguists place the origin of Proto-Sanskrit outside the subcontinent to the northwest in the plateau from which the Aryan people most likely originated. For those who argue that the great developments of Indian religion and culture are entirely indigenous, these theories are unwelcome and even heretical. It is a fascinating time in the study of Indian history, when archaeological, genetic, and linguistic findings can support or contradict ancient wisdom and traditions. But for thousands of years, at the village level, the great myths of the Rig Veda, the Yajur Veda, the Samaveda, and the Atharva Veda were transmitted to the people around their home fires. Or perhaps the stories emerged over time as the local folklore of northwestern India that developed into the formal oral recitations of the long hymns. These ancient northern people are identified in anthropological terms as the last of the black and red ware pottery culture, and become identified by 1500 BCE as the painted gray ware culture. Less urban than their Indus Valley forebears, these cultures develop settlements and small towns. The domesticated horse has been introduced, and farming is the principal activity of these peoples. The decline in the quality of Harappan pottery is matched by a rise in the quality of painted gray ware. Before the advent of Sanskrit, these people may have spoken a Proto-Dravidian language, which most scholars still believe predates Sanskrit on the subcontinent and stands as an example of native languages before the advent of Indo-European cultures. But certain language models also place the roots of Proto-Dravidian languages in the Iranian plateau around 4000 BCE. Suffice to say, the origins of both language families is still very much an open question. To the south, coastal villages in Kerala around 2000 BCE were in regular contact with traders from along the South Asia coast, exposing them to the cultural traditions of Babylon and Sumer, the Phoenicians and Greeks, and the Chinese. These influences penetrated inland over time, meeting the Hindu expansion from the north and synthesizing new aspects of the Indian character. This process continues to this day, with every new wave of settlement and influence interpreted by Indian culture through its manifold, distinct local lenses. Today, these ancient genetic, linguistic, and archaeological dynamics are being assiduously traced and untangled by legions of scholars who have a staggering wealth of not only cultural and religious traditions from which to draw, but also a staggering wealth of archaeological and historical resources that are helping to bring the origins of Insular India to outsiders like me just a bit more into focus.